Good morning, everyone. The land here at Simms Cove was named Glencoe by the first Simms family, who arrived here in the early 1860s. They started fishing these waters and have done so for 4 generations. And so today we gather here to celebrate the life of Benjamin Simms, Benny as he's known to you all, the last of the 4 generations of professional fishermen. Ben was a young boy when the family built the breakwater. You can see the remaining timber pylons just behind us at the water's edge. The family always anchored their boats here, and you may also remember seeing Ben's last boat, the Mary Ann Simms, regularly anchored here. I'm Graham Sayre, and I'm very privileged to have been asked to conduct this service for Ben today. On behalf of the family, thank you for being here, especially those who have travelled. Your presence with us is very much appreciated. The family also extend their thanks to the community nurses, including Jack Willis, who looked after Ben, treating his legs for some 40 years, and the wonderful staff of the Wallaroo Hospital Palliative Care Unit, and thanks to Dr. Fazil Junjo, all for their care of Ben, which enabled him to remain at home rather than be hospitalised in his final days. Thanks also go to the many people who have telephoned, sent flowers and cards to the family, expressing their sympathy at the passing of Ben. Special thanks go to the following people who were good friends and workmates of Ben's: Bob Curry, John O'Keefe, and Kevin Masters. It's also important today that we remember people special to Ben who have passed away but are not forgotten. And so we particularly remember Ben's brother Barry, Bill Elliott, Peter Shearer, who worked with Ben on the Mary Ann Simms and his first boat, the Rum Runner, Johnny Cadell and Norm Bracken, who helped train Ben's horses as well as rode them. Thanks also to John O'Keefe, Michael Wanganeen, Don Wapper for their regular visits to Ben over the years, and to Blair Cross, who visited Ben in the days before his own passing. Benjamin Simms, Ben or Benny, was born on the 4th of June 1931 here in Moonta, at midwife Eden's home, which he called the Garden of Eden. His parents were William Cecil and Eva Simms. Ben was an older brother to Barry, who was deceased, and to Yvonne. The family lived in Moonta, and Ben attended Moonta School until he was 13 years of age. He then joined the family fishing business. Ben was married twice, first to Kathleen Jean, known as Jean, in 1955, and then to Ellen in 1985. In the late 1990s, Ben met Henrietta, and she lived with Ben until her passing in 2012. Ben has 2 children, Marianne and Cherie. Ben is grandfather to Megan and Ben, and grandfather-in-law to Rod and Karen. He is great-grandfather to Angus, Dylan, Harley, Charlie, Molly, Miley and Jeb. Ben was a founding member with Ivan Oates, Ross Brayley and a few others of the Moonta Lions Club, and he received a life membership with them. He would have been called into military service because he was of age, but back then fishing was considered an essential service, so he continued to fish and supplied the cannery to aid the war effort. During his life, Ben also trained and owned and rode a number of racehorses. He also enjoyed a bet on his own horses. He also liked pretty women with a smile. Ben didn't like the changes that were taking place in the area. He didn't like the overfishing that was happening, and he predicted the ban on snapper. He was also against the removal of the Tippera lighthouse. The lighthouse was significant to him. As a boy, he was given a model sailing boat, which is in front of the coffin today. It was built by boat builder Jack McFarlane, and one day Ben was sailing it here in the cove, and a gust of wind took it out to sea. He thought he had lost it. The wind took the boat out to the Tippera lighthouse, some 17 kilometres out, where it was found by a fisherman who returned it to a very happy Ben. He was like a cat with 9 lives. While net fishing in the Gulf here one day, he was bitten by a gummy shark that had swum under the dinghy he was beside. And while in Port Lincoln one day, he was bitten by a white-tailed spider, which could have seen him lose his leg. Ben took charge of his own health and made the right decisions. Ben was a prolific writer of books, poems, letters, various eulogies for friends. Many of these have been published, and so through today's service I will share some of these poems with you that I and the family thought were fitting for Ben today. This first one's called There Was a Man Called Ben, written in 1968 by Ellie Hand. There was a man called Ben who used to fish now and then. He'd steer his boat through any gale, between bouts of booze and diet ale, likes burnt sandwiches and lots to drink, says it gives a man time to think, likes to gamble and play the horses, said to be a man of varied resources. As for hobbies, he has many. You've only to ask the barmaid Jenny. Quite a solid man as leather, but somehow controlled by the weather. He sports a hat he'd hate to lose. Never known to wear shoes. Gives out presents and a shout for all. If in trouble, you'd only have to call. A sense of humour rare in men. I guess that kind of sums up Ben. Ben then used his right of reply to Ellie and wrote the following. This man called Ben. This man called Ben, who you've summed up with your pen and mentioned most of which is true, has lived and loved so very few with feeling from the heart. It makes him suffer just like you the time we are apart. He has known you oh so little time, yet now, with weather fine and seagulls in the air, he is reluctant to depart upon the fishing trip that may, upon arrival, spear his heart with news, my darling, you had left that day. I'd like to invite Ben's daughter, Cherie, to come forward and present a tribute to Ben.
It's no small tribute, I can tell you. I think I see some trawlers on the horizon. There's 2 boats out there. Can you hear me okay? Ben always said I spent half my money on booze, women and horses, and the rest I wasted. Welcome to the end of an era, and to celebrate the life and times of local fishing icon Ben Simms. As Graham has mentioned, Ben often said he was born in the Garden of Eden, a sturdy little building still standing out at North Moonta. On the edge of North Moonta was the home of the local midwife, Mrs. Eden. Mrs. Eden assisted Ben's mother, Eva Hicks, to bring Ben into this world on a Thursday, the 4th of June, 1931. He didn't like being called Benjamin, said he would lick the jam off, and his name was just Ben. A man who shouldered 4 generations of boats and men, families who made the iconic fishing family Simms. He excelled and exceeded family expectations. He pioneered the southern bluefin tuna industry in 1955 and birthed a totally new fishery, the Western king prawn fishery, in 1968. I can only give a précis of his achievements in the time we have today. This narrative is also of boats and women because they held the same destiny. His first love, worthy of mention, was Pauline Kemp. Her father would not permit a union together. Things were serious enough to talk of marriage, and the fallout was remembered clearly throughout both their lives. We spent some time looking for her much later in his life, but we were unsuccessful. But it was this time with Pauline that he worked and learned from a builder friend of his, Wolf Diamond, who was a brickmaker and stonemason. He showed him how to make the bricks for the inner walls of his house and helped him make the moulds. He could still remember the brew ingredients decades later. In no time, he'd made enough to finish the house that he intended to live in with Pauline. Ben always rode his horse to school, a liver chestnut called Jimmy. His love of horses continued throughout his life. He owned nearly 60 racehorses, employed 2 close friends to train them. The first was Johnny Cadell, an incredible individual, an actor, rodeo rider, jockey and horse whisperer. He lived in a room in the horse stables and he was looked after by my mum Jean, our mum Jean. And later Norm Bracken, also a jockey, with his wife and children who lived in Ben's shack in Trelawney Street. Horses were definitely one way he enjoyed life, and some of the stories will bring a tear to your eye in both laughter and sadness. In his book, Licorice and All Sorts, published in 2001, he describes his last day at school, which I thought was best to hear in his own words, and I quote, "At 13 years of age, I was expelled from school after a run-in with my teacher, Dudley Alcock. We had a difference of opinion, and we had a bit of a fight. He always seemed to have it in for me, but in hindsight, maybe I was at fault. My mind was never on schoolwork, but on fishing boats, weather, etc. I won the fight because I went to work with my father the day after. It was good to be free of the drudgery of school, but the headmaster, Mac McCarthy, told my father I was no good and would never make a citizen. One day not long after, I was at the Moonta Hotel having a drink. I would always have a schooner of beer and a schooner of squash in the background in case the local copper came in. I was still only 13. My old headmaster came in and saw me there. 'What the hell are you doing here, Simms?' he said. I replied, 'I reckon for the same reason as you, sir.' He scratched his head and said, 'Well, fair enough.' A little later in came my father, Ross, and Mr. Mack said, 'Hey Ross, do you condone your young pup here to be in here drinking beer?' And my father said, 'He's been out fishing with me since 2 o'clock this morning, and we caught a lot of fish. I reckon he's done more than a man's work today, and so he deserves a man's drink. Don't you think?' 'Well, fair enough,' said Mr. Mack for the second time." Unquote. At this time, Ben had his own dinghy that he called Daisy. He would fish on his own, but he also worked with his father Ross in the Norwest Trader until about the age of 18 years. Ross Simms was a tough, gruff man, and so Ben, partly to move away from close quarters with his father, built the Rum Runner, his second boat. Daisy was the first. She was built in 1948, this is the Rum Runner, and 28 feet long, built by Jack McFarlane at Crookshanks Corner, Birkenhead. He fished this boat with his brother Barry, his uncle Bill, and his lifetime friend Bill Elliott for many years. In 1950 there was an explosion on the Rum Runner, with Ben and Uncle Bill aboard. It was a harrowing night, but they found them both safe and well in the morning near Bird Island. Freezing too, by all accounts. Ben's heart would miss a beat any time he heard a loud noise. At the age of 24, Ben married Kathleen Jean Sheriff. It was 1955. His first daughter, Marianne, was born in 1956, and I came along close behind in 1957. As far as we know, the only progeny of Ben Simms. This was no trivial matter, as Jean was then married with 3 children to Jack Finch, a wonderful man from all accounts. She was to divorce him and tore her family apart for the love of Ben Simms. He had a powerful effect on women, and to quote him, only got a few slaps across the face. Such was the strength of his love and character. We've kept in touch with the Finch family, especially close while Jean was alive, and became friends over many years. Jean passed away in 1991. The Marianne Simms was built in 1958. Ben was 27. She was the first refrigerated fishing vessel in South Australia. 56 foot long, built by R.T. Searles and Son, Jenkins Street, Birkenhead. With the most up-to-date echo sounding equipment and radar of the new electronic age. One of the first to board the boat with Ben was Licorice the cat, who remained aboard the Marianne Simms until Licorice's passing in 1976, aged 17 years. Ben's current cat, Smokey Dawson, a genetic descendant of Licorice, reminded Ben of Licorice by walking the bulwark rail on the front veranda outside his bedroom window every morning. I remember well the New Year's Day regattas at Port Hughes each year. In the alehouse at Wallaroo is a fabulous photo on display depicting Ben winning the all-comers race in 1960 with his father Ross some way back in second place. He'd say the old man would never live that down. When Ben first went tuna fishing, he purchased an 8mm movie camera from Jack Randall, who owned a camera shop in Port Lincoln. It was a wind-up battery. It had a wind-up battery, great colour, no sound, and never left the boat. He said buying that camera was the best thing he ever did. Hundreds of hours of 8mm reel and footage have been captured and converted to digital technology. Now, when Ben was 31 and the Marianne Simms in her 4th year, tuna industry was just emerging. By 1962, she was altered to pole tuna in the waters south of Port Lincoln. To quote Ben again from his book Licorice and All Sorts, "After school I would run home to go out fishing. Schoolwork was far from my mind, but I was later to regret the lack of learning geometry, trigonometry and algebra, as when I went tuna fishing later in life, I found it was invaluable for my sightings, positioning with sextant and chart work. However, by cutting corners and having inborn capabilities, I got by, and during my years tuna fishing, I was never far from the right landfall, returning sometimes 200 and 300 miles south and west of Port Lincoln." Unquote. Ben took the family to live in Port Lincoln for one tuna season, I think it was 1964. The fishery brought with it a cutthroat ending between the many boats that hunted fewer and smaller tuna as the years went by. Even in its heyday, it was a thrilling and dangerous employment. Ben describes these days as the most fulfilling and enjoyable of his life. The men he made friends with then bonded for life. Men like Ken Tidswell, skipper of the Estelle Star, Bill Gordon, skipper of the DG, Mike Bubris, skipper of the Cape Barren, the Lucan family, the Puglisi family, the Forbes brothers, the Haldane brothers, and one other in particular, measuring the dangers involved in the game, is Jerry Jelinek, skipper of the Smarter, which was lost with all hands in one of the many storms that had to be navigated on a regular basis. By 1967, these wild fish disappeared. and this was when the business became cutthroat in order to maintain their income. Ben, however, was able to walk away from all of this and to resume net and hook fishing a bit closer to home. In 1969, he submitted a tender for a job in the Marianne to survey for underwater power lines going across Backstairs Passage from Cape Jarvis to Cuttlefish Bay on Kangaroo Island in October 1969. 2 weeks' work, 10 trips over and back, using sextants for positioning. He didn't really want to do it, but was asked if he would submit a tender for it. He submitted a ridiculous amount of money, thinking they would laugh at it, and won the contract. On this trip, he experienced, and I quote, "the worst weather I have ever put in," unquote. Ben in the Marianne Simms was one of the first 2 boats responsible for pioneering the prawning industry in South Australia. Unlike snapper, tuna and other fish, this fishery was completely new. In 1968, these prawns had not been caught in sufficient numbers before. Ben's good friend Roger Howlett, whom he'd known since the tuna days, often spoke about areas of the Gulf where the prawns might be found in larger numbers. It was a matter of finding the right place. "The gutter," said Ben, and Roger agreed. The next morning, Roger asked if he, Ben, would take them to market for him. 200 pound of prawns went before the market buyers in East End markets. They did not have a name at that stage and were sold, as Ben would say, for the princely sum of 50 cents per pound. They didn't know what to do with them. So Ben was the first person to bring the Western King prawn to market, with Roger the first man to catch a marketable size. They were good mates. Together with 5 other trawlers of Spencer Gulf, soon join them, they brought this delicacy to the world. A few years later, 1972, now 41 years old, he worked with his good friend Jim Rakovolis of the Fitzroy markets, and Professor Zucchini, a professor in marine biology from Japan. They trawled the Gulf, measuring water temperatures and sampling the seafood of the vast expanse of Spencer Gulf. They caught a daytime catch of female prawns, and in a plankton net off the stern of the Marianne Simms right out here, spawned the first Western King prawn in captivity. These tiny specimens were taken back to the prawn farm at Port Broughton, and they commenced the first attempt to farm them in commercial quantities. Some great video footage of this whole story. Like tuna, the cost of getting them on the plate was the same as the cost to grow them to plate size. So while successful in determining if this was a viable method, they could not make it work financially. Ben began to develop an allergy of his eyes from the seaweed or something that came up in the nets. If he continued to trawl for prawns, he would have gone blind. He talked of his good friend Betty Lockwood, who helped him at that time to save his sight. Ben met his second wife, Ellie Hand, from 1979 to 1989, they owned and ran a licensed seafood restaurant at Port Broughton called the Captain's Way. He personally supplied all the fish and is said to have given away most of the booze in free drinks to patrons. Ben married Ellie at the restaurant in 1985. He also celebrated his 50th birthday, a fancy dress party, in 1981 or 2. 82 it had to be, didn't it? Ben's 2 girls around this time, Marianne was a working mother of 2 and living locally. Her children, Megan and Benjamin, were very young and embraced completely by Ben and Ellie. We all bonded. Sherry at this stage began her marriage of 40 years to lifelong partner Peter Farmer. We decided not to have children, and we lived in the tropical Northern Territory for 20 years. In 1986, Ben did the reenactment of the bagged grain era in the Mary Ann Simms. It was at Port Broughton community event, statewide I think. The stern of the boat was used for the Port Broughton swim-through fish line. He captured great video coverage on this as well. He wrote his first book, End of the Gulf Fishery, in 1988. This was when he developed his love of little dogs. His first 2 toy poodles were Honey and Sher. Sher fished with him on the boat for her lifetime. Later came Angel, whom he has written a beautiful poem in memory of. Today, another poodle is here with us. It's Sweetie. Sweetie Pie, and sometimes just Pie. And is to be his last love. Ellie left to move to Queensland and try to resolve asthma and be closer to her family in the mid to late 1990s. At this stage, Ben surrounded himself with his grandchildren. They meant the world to him. He was the family man for them and loved all 7 of them. They are Angus, Dylan, Harley, Charlie, Molly, Miley and Jeb. Fortunately for Ben, unlike many of the others who lost their livelihoods in various fishing industries, he could always return to net and hook fishing, which he continued to do until his mid-80s, until the 3rd of June 2005, the day before his 73rd birthday, he succumbed to the government pressure to relinquish his net licence in a government project designed to assess the impact of professional fishing on the fishing effort. They progressively reduced fishing effort in 6 priority areas of Spencer Gulf, allowing the amateur fishing to continue. A mistake, Ben would say. And then the first snapper ban on the 28th of September 2019. This was predicted in his first book, End of the Gulf Fishery, in 88. He rallied with the Port Hughes Progress Association in an effort to stop a proposed marina/boat ramp being installed at Port Hughes. He's recorded as saying, "If you don't include an opening for the sand to move up and down the coast, you will be dredging it for the rest of your life." They do. His second book, titled Licorice and All Sorts of Fish's Tale, was published in 2001. His first DVD film, produced in 2019, Snapper Fishing in the Good Old Days, was done by a more modern, still analogue, video camera with sound. Ellie was with him on the day. It's just one day out fishing for an hour and a half and unloading. Followed by the second DVD, made up from his 8mm footage. This was Talking Tuna 50 Years Ago is the title, and that was published in 2008. Miraculously produced. That is an incredible story of how he got that 8mm footage onto video all by himself. His third book, also published in 2008, was titled A Collection of Poetry and Verse. His third DVD, History of the Western King Prawn in South Australia, which is not the story that the Prawn Association will tell you, was published in 2018. In his 79th year, Ben received a written directive from Port Broughton Council that the boat was forbidden from laying alongside the jetty in her winter haven at Port Broughton. This was despite his plea to the council to reconsider the historic nature of the vessel, its tourist attraction and its connection with the area. To assist Ben's plight, and I hope I've got this story right, about this time a meeting took place with Ben's cousin Stephen Simms and another man who, as I understand, contacted Michael Nance, a businessman in Wallaroo, who instigated the incorporation of the Historic Vessel Association. The association commenced September 2010 to look after the boat, and it continued until 2017, while the Mary Ann held a prominent berth at the Wallaroo Marina during this time. We tried unsuccessfully to maintain the boat. Marianne and I became Dad's arms and legs. It was incredibly difficult for us, as near pensioners, to do the work required to keep her in the manner with which she was accustomed. Michael Nance rallied to try to maintain the status quo. Selling raffle tickets and collecting donation tins was simply not enough. We needed many dollars, but more importantly, the expertise now missing along with the fishing industry that had ended. Ben became agitated with the delays and the work needed, many sleepless nights, and many aches and pains for Marianne and myself. Kevin Masters did all he could to achieve the goals and listened intently and learned more than any other man about the intricacies of the Marianne Simms. And we thank him for that. The Marianne was added to the historic to the Historic Vessel Association, to the Historic Vessel Register, nearly finished, in April 2012. She was gifted by tender to 3 well-intentioned gentlemen in 2017. It was an historic day when she was moved from the Wallaroo Marina and sailed back to Port Lincoln. An event captured beautifully by Ben's good friend Diana Walter in her production of a tribute to Ben and the Marianne Simms. Now, the Marianne moves on to her next custodian. How appropriate. A young man here today, I hope, and I hope to get to know him by the end of this day. I see similarities in Ben when he was the same age with a new boat that held so many expectations. Double-ribbed by Searle's shipyard. She may well outlive us all. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to invite Robin Samble to come forward, who I believe wants to say a few words.
I'm going to apologise in advance for anything that I double up on, but it's inevitable with a person like Ben that that's going to happen. Ben, or Benny, father, grandfather, mate, fisherman, writer, cousin. Wow, that list sure goes on. I'm Robin, Ben's cousin. As Ben would say, you can always tell a Simms by the cut of the jib. Our great-grandfather Curly Joe, as you've heard, began the fishing industry here in 1862, and Ben's and my grandparents were both born in Glencoe Cottage behind you. Growing up here, there were several Simms boats at anchor and dinghies close to shore, protected in the stormy weather by the breakwater the men built. Ben Sr., Percy, Benny, Barry, Harry and Charlie Smith all fished from here when I was a little girl. My earliest memory of Ben was the day the Marianne arrived at the cove for the first time. It was a very proud moment, especially seeing young Ben at the wheel. I think it was all lost on me at the time. I was just a little kid. But when I think about the significance and how old Ben was, it makes it even more incredible. Fish were plentiful and were brought ashore by dinghy, a very difficult task in stormy weather, when often the family at large in the cove were called to help. The truck was loaded, and I remember it lumbering up Simms Cove. Well, I wouldn't call it a road, but it was a track, as it was heavily laden. I was also quite lucky to be in the wheelhouse with Ben on his final day, as he deftly brought the Marianne into the marina at Wallaroo. So very bittersweet memories. Sherry touched on Australia Day at Port Hughes. We were all enlisted as ballast. None of us terribly good at sailing. And the sailing races were heavily contested, shall we say, between especially the Simms men. A lot of colourful conversations and maybe the odd word that can't be repeated, and especially not for young ears. I love watching Ben scull out to the boat. Such a lost art. Many of my friends used to say, "Who's that old fella? You know, the one that does this." And I'd say, "That," with pride, "is my cousin Ben." You know, it was very hard to write anything today. His life was so large, the memories so many. But I guess some of my favourite memories are of Ben sitting under the veranda over here at Glencoe with us, beer in hand, surprise, eating his smoked fish. My dog used to wait for Ben to drive past in his dad's old truck, and she'd go, "Oh, it sounds like Ben." She would be up at the wall watching intently, and of course he'd pull up, come to the shore, make sure the beach was still here, make sure the weather was doing what it should do that day, pull up in front of the house, and there were the smoked fish. Very much well remembered. He would regale stories of days gone by. Very colourful. A raconteur, I would call Ben. His favourite saying, "All the best." Maybe not that last word correctly said. You can see me afterwards for the actual wording. Ben, what a life, hey? A cheeky grin, a twinkle in his eye. The hat, he had two, you know, one for best. And always a beer in hand. And in fact, the last time I went to see Ben a few weeks ago, the red wine was at hand and his hand went over and deftly poured another red. Amazing. He always said, "Don't you dare take my picture until I get another beer, young lady." When you were talking about the dog Sweetie, he always said, "Hello, sweetheart. How are you?" I was terrified the first time I went to visit him at the house. It said at the door, I think something along the lines of, "Friends welcome, relatives make an appointment." Is that right? And I said, "Oh, I didn't make an appointment." He said, "You're all right, sweetheart, come in," with a twinkle in his eye. For the extended family, we've now lost another thread to our past. I've often said, "Oh, I don't know, I'm not sure about that." Have you seen Ben? Go up the hill and see Ben. He'll know. I think it's up to maybe Sherry and me a little bit now with some of that history. Ben will be sadly missed by all of us. It's testament to the number of people who've come out today. So I say, Ben, you will be missed. May the wind be at your back. May the sun shine on your face as you sail over the horizon to your final resting place.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you, Cherie, for a beautiful tribute and history of your father. After we finish here today, you'll be invited back to the Seagate for refreshments and an opportunity to reminisce Ben's life. And while you're there, there'll be a presentation of pictures of Ben throughout his life, and also a memorial table with many objects from Ben's life on display. As you check them out, you'll be able to reflect on your own relationship with Ben and his part in your life. In 2011, Ben wrote a poem, "I started fishing when I left school." I started my fishing when I left school. The price that they were, I thought, what a fool. But the sea was open and ready for me in a challenging future and what it could be. My first boat was open and 18 feet long. She was built by my uncle for almost a song. With lug sail and oars, I was happy as hell to pull through the waves and catch fish to sell. I called her Daisy 'cause she sat in the water just like a duck. The whiting at the time was a shilling a pound, but to catch ruffs and mullets at sixpence was better, I found. So I needed a larger boat to handle these fish. I designed a new cutter to fulfil my wish. 48 foot long with an ice hold midship to keep a good catch, with an engine for fine weather when sails were not worth a patch. 1948, she was built by McFarlane at Birkenhead of Port Adelaide fame. I called her Rum Runner and thought myself it was a good name. She was lovely to look at and delightful to sail. When caught in bad weather, she'd handle a gale. The years I worked her, we caught tons of all sorts of fish. A larger boat I did design to take her place was more than I could wish. 46 foot long and a schooner rigged, the first one refrigerated for scale fish in the state. 20 tons capacity, she was an all-time great. R.T. Searles and Sons at Birkenhead built her, and she does a wonderful job. She was launched in January 1958 and was watched intently by a then drunken mob. So in May of the same year, she steamed under the bridge to head to open sea, to 50 years of the best of all fishing for her and for me. So let me look back on those wonderful days and the stories she could tell. She can still be viewed in her splendour, and me in the alehouse as well. Ben's last boat, the Mary Ann Simms. Family and friends, it comes now time for us to say farewell to Ben. Ben was a character. He enjoyed a drink. He worked hard and played hard. Every photo of him, he had to have him holding a beer. He was strong and brave and loyal and a good provider to his family. In some of the tributes to Ben that I've seen, he has been called a Moonta legend, and I believe that to be so true. Ben wrote another poem called Progress, My Mind's Eye View, 1937 to 2005. A lifetime depends on the luck of the draw. Some live it short, some live it more. But the real lucky ones are the persons who can live it full and enjoy it from the boy to the man. Looking back on your life, as some of us do, your school days and happenings come into view. I'd walk to school over meadow and hill. Not a sign of a house was there then. Rabbits and birds in abundance, foxes and hares as well. The beautiful sandhills and beaches, the clean air and salt water smell. All this comes into my mind's eye when I look about me today. The quiet old place is in turmoil. It's torn up where I used to play. But progress is something that cannot be stopped. There's houses and sheds and boatyards and a paddock that's no longer cropped, and hills that are ravaged and altered. The sandhills are no longer there. My mind's eye is sent reeling by that Pat Ricky mob who seem to not care. Ben, may your love be reflected in all who knew you. May you continue to live on through the lives of those you leave behind. Your legacy is the memory of a great name and a great example. And so, into the freedom of wind and sunshine, we let you go. Into the dance of the moon and planets, we let you go. Into the wind's breath and the hands of the star maker, we let you go. Into the ever-changing tides and the swell of the sea, we let you go. And into the sadness and smiles of our memories, we let you go. Ashes to ashes, earth to earth, and dust to dust. Go safely, go with our love, and may you forever rest in peace, Ben Simms. I'd like to ask Robert Davis from Skinner Family Funerals to come forward for the conclusion of the service.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the service for the late Benjamin Simms. On behalf of Marianne, Cherie, Megan and Ben, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance here today. It's been greatly appreciated. In a moment we will be carrying Ben's coffin to the back of the hearse, where you'll have your opportunity to pay your respects by placing a tribute. From there we'll be making our way for a final drive to Port Hughes and Moonta Bay before returning back to Skinner Family Funerals. As Graham mentioned, the family would also like to extend an invitation to those here today, and there'll be some refreshments and light snacks available at the Seagate, Moonta Bay after the service. Can I now please ask for the pallbearers to come forward? And ladies and gentlemen, those that are able to stand, could you please stand? Thank you.
Yeah, mate. Yeah, I did. Yeah, mate.
What do you leave it now? Yeah, about 20 minutes. So, you go clear now? If you want, I don't know if you need Robbie to sort of us. Might come and have a cup of tea. Yeah. No, that's right. So 6-pack twice. Really? Good at a few bloody beers for years, eh? Good at a few beers for years.
I've been there too. There's also very good mates with that. Yeah. I've known him since I was 8 years old.
Wow.
And he used to come and give me a run. Oh, I just don't do it. You could. Take that back of the sea.
Well done.
So the Hampshire. Look, because we do the abalone down in town, we serve it in a shell, I think. Then they disappear. They just get dropped in the handbags. There's some honest people that say, look, I love the shell, so I charge them. Well, yeah.
You've got to do it here.
Well done.
Hand them in here.
Yeah, I've never seen it again. You'll like it. These people.
You know, it's just
Yep. Yeah, I'll tell you that was a beautiful tribute from Sherry. Absolutely magnificent. Oh. Yes, yeah. Beautifully done. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, no, that was just magnificent. Bloody character. I need to find it. I'm sure it's focused.
How are you, Robert? Well done, Robert. School.
I love it. know you have. I didn't realise.
So you should live in Sydney.
So slippery. Doesn't fit the schedule. No grip. Different times, marks on there. You've got the boats.
I'm good. How are you?
Next thing,
Did it? I knew that there would be so much there, and then I wrote something, and then I left it open, and then I had to So he used to say breast. I know you did. I know. You said you can't oh my God! It's a long lost relic. How is this? Here I am. Darling, you're on. Oh, it's good to see you. And Harry so we sat and he laughs. And one of the things is lawyer, well, he I was going to say that. I thought I'll probably say that one. Being completely inappropriate. Girls managed to save it. I'm just going to go and catch.
That looks all right, doesn't it? It's like rubbish, huh?
Definitely, yeah. Final rack.
I went to Peter Watson, he was how the fourth West Coast. Yeah, bloody unbelievable.
Bloody Elvis for mine, bro. Bloody Elvis for mine, bro.
Did you?
That is lots of
First operation was 2021. Second one was 2020. Nothing like all that like that fix it. Done a couple of
Sick of his never bought a drink when Betty was around.
What it's supposed to be. Look, everywhere she went.
Time.